Manny, thank you so much. And I also want to thank everyone who poured their blood and sweat into this conference. I know how much work this takes and what an honor it is to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Anderson. I prefer to be called Jeff, actually. That's my favorite name for myself. I have my students call me that. Please do refer to me as Jeff if you ever want to call me anything. Today we're going to talk about grading for equity. Let me go ahead and pull up my screen. I've kind of two things on my mind at this moment. One, I have a PowerPoint presentation, but to be completely honest with you, I don't like the version of professional development which is kind of modeled on the one and done mechanism. So one of the things that I really struggle with is that these topics that we talk about at places like this are often very near and dear to our heart, and we're only given an hour, and then after that hour we're expected to go on and make changes, and that's really hard. One of the commitments that I make to myself and everybody that I engage with in a talk like this is that I want to create a platform that you can refer back to these ideas later in case you want to. So what I just sent in the chat is a link to a blog post on this subject. It has everything that I'm about to talk with you. So here's a little blurb about it. There's the abstract. Here are some outcomes that I wrote for the presentation. What I expect, what I hope, that you all actually create the learning outcomes. I don't, but yeah, this is here. I'm going to be recording the talk, the part that I'm doing, not anybody else. And I'll post a YouTube link to this video later in case you want to refer back to it. I'll do timestamps on that. And then down here, you'll see that the PowerPoint presentation that I have is linked. It should be live. I checked beforehand. I would love it if somebody could actually check these and see that they're working. There's a PDF copy. I'm going to talk about some data, and I actually share with you every bit of data that I've generated for this talk. And then I have some examples later in the talk, and basically what you're seeing here is that everything that I share with you in this talk, you have open access. I plan to sponsor this until I die. Hopefully that will be later than a year from now. That's the prayer. So I just wanted to say that if you're worried about... Oh, let me shut up for a minute. Yep. Was there a comment? Okay. So that's there for you. With that said, I guess I'll get started. I do have, at the end of this talk, my favorite thing to say, actually, is that the least interesting person in this room is me. I find you all so much more interesting than I am. What I'd really love to do is actually just, have you write on this subject for an hour, but I feel like we've set up the expectation that I should be talking for a little bit, so I'll give you some of the work that I've done, but towards the end, I hope to shut up and get you all centered, and I have a Google Doc that I'll share again with some feedback from this talk, just get you thinking about it a little bit. So, yeah, let's jump right in. Let me see if this is the first I'm working at. Yeah, there we go. All right, so we're going to talk about grading for equity as a college math instructor. There we go. So I want to share with you kind of a journey. This is a story rather than a result. This is success data that I pulled from Foothill's website from summer 2018 through fall 2019. This is when I was using traditional grading. And what you see is white students versus non-white student success. 2018, I think, was the first time I was aware that we could actually pull this data, and when I went to go back this quarter and look at my previous, that's the last thing that I have access to. One of the things that was really interesting, I've been finagling my grading system since I started teaching in 2008, and I've worked really hard to get to the 79, it's actually like a 76 to 77% success ratio as a class, but then I plateaued for I don't know, a year or 2 years, every quarter I was right at that 70, and I had one class that I broke into 80, and I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. And then I couldn't recreate that, right? And I actually was thinking, there's a part of me that was thinking that this might be an asymptote. There is a problem with this asymptote, of course, because in my own classes, my white students are, there's a differential between the achievement of white and non-white. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I have, very detailed data on what this means. And I was talking with a mentor and senior colleague of mine called Patrick Morris, and he really gave me inspiration. He's like, oh, you can break that 80%. You just got to think critically about what you're doing. And what you're about to see is that critical thinking. So one question that I've asked myself since I started teaching is, why are the things in my class happening? Why are they occurring? And what power do I have to change them? And this question came up big time for me when I was thinking about that differential between 79 and 75%. And then also, how do I break through that 80% success rate that I've worked 8 years nonstop finagling, and I can't break it? So the central question of this inquiry has been, why is this happening, and what power do I have to change it? So when I think about grading for equity, I actually think about two separate focuses of this idea. One of them is called anti-racist policies, and the other one is called assessment policies. And we're going to talk about both of those, and you'll see that those kind of run through this entire progression. So my first place to start actually is one of my favorite, what I call equitable grading practices. Or principles, and that principle, I write this for myself, is to center humility and action-oriented curiosity as a pillar of my anti-racist teaching practices. So I want to be humble, and I want to be action-oriented in the way that I ask questions of myself and of my practice. My favorite motto to say about myself as a teacher is that I suck today, but a little less than yesterday. So I'm not as good as I want to be, for sure, but I'm committed to getting better over time. What you'll see in this presentation is under each of these is a blog post that I write on this. I'm very much committed to sharing ideas in forums. So if you ever wanted to follow up on some of these ideas, you can just go to these blogs and read about them on your own time. So one of the things that I think a lot about in teaching is to translate principles and beliefs into actual concrete actions, right? So beliefs, I start with beliefs, and then I translate that into action. So when I think about my principle of centering humility and action-oriented curiosity, the practices that I bring in, use to realize that principle include reading about race and anti-racism, so really getting serious about getting educated in this space, exploring my own identities, my positionality, and my socialization to understand how race impacts my life and shows up in my identity. And then also maintaining a list of anti-racist terms so that as I'm thinking about what grading for equity means, I can filter that through the scholarship of anti-racism. This is something that I feel very passionate about. So one thing that came up almost immediately as I was thinking about why is this happening is that I cannot sidestep the race question. I have to explore race. I have to actually get into race relations in the United States and get educated. And the way that I started this was actually well before my time at Foothill College. I was an RA at UC Santa Barbara. We had racial sensitivity training, and then from a young age, many of my closest friends were non-white, and so I was having discussions about race from a very young age. But I never had academic discussions until really I was at Foothill. There's a strong community here of people that recognize that academic study of anti-racism is a very powerful thing for college educators. I was trained by Foothill College. They came up with two different diversity trainings. One of them was called Courageous Conversations About Race. This is by an author named Glenn Singleton. He runs a company called the Pacific Education Group. I actually met Glenn and was involved with three of his trainings. After those trainings, I went out and got his book, and I read that book. I'm on my second iteration right now. This book is all about how educators can have conversations about race and really keep engaged in that. I feel really strongly for myself that I want to meet the 4 agreements that he outlines, and those are to stay engaged, to experience discomfort, to speak my truth, and to accept and expect non-closure. I hope that that you see that I've been engaged in this for a long time, and I will do it until I'm 6 feet under. I don't know if this is going to be uncomfortable for you. It has been very uncomfortable for me, which means that I'm doing better work than I was when I was younger. At the end of this talk, I hope that you see that there's some non-closure. Wouldn't it be nice if we could deal with anti-racism in 1 hour? But that's not how things work. So with those 4 agreements in mind for myself, the next thing that I like to think about is 6 conditions for courageous conversation. This comes from Glenn Singleton's work. And you're going to see this throughout the talk. The reason that I'm setting this up is that I use this as a framework for filtering my experience when thinking about anti-racism and also grading. So one of the first conditions for really engaging in racial dialogue is to focus on the personal, local, immediate, meaning to say, filter these conversations through my own experience, my lived experience, not what other people said, not, hearsay, but literally, what do I notice and what do I observe? Another one is to isolate race, so to focus on race explicitly and intentionally. We'll see a lot about that. You saw that in some of my data. And then also realize that knowledge is socially constructed, and particular racial meaning is inherited, interpreted, and passed on from one generation to the next. I actually would extend that. Both racial meaning and grading systems are inherited, interpreted, and passed on from one generation to the next. Those two things actually intersect, and we'll see that later in the talk, but the whole idea is that much of the meaning that we bring into conversations about race is a social construction. The next one is to monitor conversations and use the courageous compass, conversation compass. This is going to be, you'll see that I use this throughout the talk to really take a pulse on myself and stay engaged without disconnecting. And then number 5 reminds me of one of my favorite things, which is to keep a list of anti-racist terms. Glenn Singleton says, keep and refine a working definition of race. I have this, we can talk about it. And then the last one is to examine the presence and role of whiteness. So how does whiteness show up in life and in my experiences? So as I talk about this, I'm going to kind of come back to some of these ideas. So the courageous conversation compass is a compass, really a model for humanity, I suppose, like the humanity within each of our souls. And what Glenn Singleton says is that when we're talking about race, we want to act and think and be in our full humanity. But there's really 4 different pieces of our reaction. One of them is thinking or intellectual within the head. The other is believing, our soul and our sense of moral justice and what's right. Another one is emotional. So what are we feeling? What does our heart say? And the other one is relational, acting. What do our hands and feet do? How do we actually, engage with this work? And it's very helpful sometimes to be able to place myself on one of these spectrums and make sure that I'm not jumping to conclusions without thinking about what's missing. And I'll show this throughout the conversation, how I use this to kind of guide my thinking through these kind of difficult conversations, stuff that I really haven't been trained to do by the educational system. So with that in mind, with that framework in mind, I come back to that central question, which is, why is it the case, 2018, that I'm noticing racially predictable achievement gaps in my own classes? Certainly it is not my intention to make those happen, and yet I can see it in the data. I see it in my success data. Why is this happening, and what power do I have? Well, in order to answer that question, one of the first things that Glenn Singleton suggests, and it's also in many other places, is that I have to actually understand how I am racialized. What is my socialization? So what you're seeing on this slide is called positionality. It's also social identity. I've done this activity probably 6 times, 7 times. This little wheel took me about 4 hours. It's done in LaTeX, which is really fun. If you're interested in this, you can. This is a great site, social identity wheel. You can kind of go here and play around with it. The point of this, though, is that every identity that you see here, my age, my gender, my sex, this one was kind of funny. Tribal. I actually do think we have Native American blood on my grandfather's side, but I'm a 3rd-generation immigrant, mostly, so that's what that means. But the point of all these social identities is to focus on race. So let me just highlight that in yellow. I am a white man. That's kind of an important thing for me to recognize when I'm thinking about race. So when I think about being white, one of the first questions that I ask myself, well, what would it be like if I was a black man in our society? And specifically, let me keep it personal, local, immediate. Let me think about the spaces that I've lived in and make some observation about the presence of black men, right? So this was one of the thoughts that I had as I was thinking about how race shows up in my classes and also what my life as a white man is like. And I can say, personal, local, immediate, if I was a black man, I believe that I would almost certainly not have a BS in mathematics. I graduated from UC Santa Barbara in 2007. I cannot say for sure that I met every math major, but I can say that I took over 15 upper division math classes, and then I went to 3 graduations with math people. I went to the honors graduation with math people. I went to the math department graduation and the larger one, and I cannot remember seeing a black male face in that entire crowd in any of those spaces. That doesn't mean that a black man was not in that space, but either I don't remember it or they weren't there. And statistically speaking, the number of black men that graduate with their BS in mathematics is quite low. I've done research on this. I didn't include it in this talk because we're not talking about data right here. We're talking about kind of the reflection piece of race. Another thing that I can say with full confidence is that in my master's degree and PhD at UC Davis, there was a single black man in the over 100 graduate students that I met for 5 years. It was actually six different years of graduate students, my year and then 6 beyond. And then as I progressed, the next generation came through. There was not a single black male instructor. At my current job, we don't have a black male math teacher, right? So, you know, if this was true, if it's true that as a black man, I would have been socialized out, weeded out of these spaces, I would not be in this room today. And another way to say this is, another thing that this means is that I wouldn't own my current home. So, this is a hard counterfactual to kind of think about, but what I'm saying here is that white privilege has been instrumental in my life in earning my degrees, in getting my job, in owning my home. And I need to be able to sit with that. I need to understand that when I come into a classroom, I'm bringing that socialization with me, and that when I'm reflecting on the experiences of my students, much of their reality might be outside of my understanding because of how I was socialized and the spaces I exhibit, right? So there's kind of a responsibility that I have to think outside of the box and really collect information from people from different racial groups so that I can understand their perspective as I do this iterative feedback on improving my own grading mechanisms, right? And this is heavy. This is really heavy. In fact, with those observations in mind, I had to ask myself, when I'm thinking about why is this happening and what power do I have, and I start to recognize the gravity of the reality of race in my life, I actually came to the feeling quite quickly. I started to feel angry. I started to feel guilty. I started to feel a little lied to, right? I have for years told myself that the reason that I have done well in math is because I'm a hard worker and I use, strategic learning skills. But what would it be if I had to say to myself, well, actually the reason that I've achieved a lot is very much tied into my identity as a white man, not just a mathematician, right? And that makes me angry. It makes me frustrated. It makes me feel almost lied to, right? Like meritocracy doesn't exist. But the nice thing is with this compass, I can say, okay, well, those are my feelings. Where else am I here? And I can't help but go over to the head part of my being, which is to say, okay, well, I have these feelings, but let me think through, let me get educated on kind of some of the larger dynamics here. So the next step was actually to think about, how racism shows up in my life. And this book is a really good one. Any book that you see or references are all of the books that I reference in this talk, I've read more than once, probably twice to 3 times. I have a lot to say about reading systems, but there's a bunch of stuff that I've read that is not in here, but I'm trying to kind of cherry pick some of the most powerful ideas on helping me along this pathway. So as I was thinking about this reality that I live in, and also the idea that perhaps race is alive and well in my class, right? And that it's very important for me to address this. I started to think about racism, and this quote was really kind of useful. For many white people, the image of a racist is a hood-wearing Klan member or a name-calling Archie Bunker figure. These images might be called active racism, blatant, intentional acts of racial bigotry and discrimination. So I can come back to this compass and sit and ask myself a thinking question, which is, am I practicing active racism in my classes? With full confidence, I can say, no, I am not. I'm not on that train. I am definitely actually fully invested in equity. And yet, when I read on, something came up. So the next line in that book is, passive racism is more subtle and can be seen in the collusion of laughing when a racial joke is told, letting exclusionary hiring practice go unchallenged, accepting as appropriate the omission of people of color from curriculum, and avoiding difficult race-related issues. Okay, well, avoiding difficult race-related issues, I can do that as a white man, right? This is part of white privilege. I don't have to talk about race every single day if I don't want to. So that's kind of interesting. And then because racism is so ingrained in the fabric of American institutions, it's easily self-perpetuating. All that is required to maintain it is to go about my business as usual. And I can be quite candid. I actually practiced passive racism maybe 3 weeks ago. I was trying to rent a car, and as I did it, the guy on the other side of the counter asked for my insurance. And I didn't have a recent insurance. My insurance, 2021, 2022, got sent out within like 3 weeks before then, and I had forgot it at home. So I told him, oh, I don't have my most recent one, but I can give you last year's, and he accepted that. And about 2 minutes after he accepted that, he made a really disparaging remarks about Asian drivers. Like, it just was inappropriate. It came out of left field. Before I had a chance to react, my brother, who was with me, diverted the conversation. He recognized what was happening, and he immediately asked a conversation about the technical part of it. But in that moment, my immediate reaction was to not engage, to not call out that racism, because that man had power over me. If I created a scene in that moment, he might have said, you know what, I'm not going to accept your insurance, and you need to go back and get the other one, and that would have changed my day completely. And the moment that I recognize, well, that actually is an act of passive racism. It's not, I'm not doing it on purpose, but I'm letting something go unaddressed, unchallenged. And the moment that I have that in mind, I can start to filter other experiences in my classes. And this leads me to the hypothesis, the question: if I'm thinking about why racism is why the achievement gap is happening in my classes and what power do I have? Let me reframe this with that knowledge in mind. So what if I ask myself a different question? What if it were true that I practice passive racism when I let traditional grading practices go unchallenged in my classroom and thus replicate racially predictable achievement gaps in my classes? In other words, instead of thinking about why are the achievement gaps happening, what if I were to think to myself that the reason that they're happening is because I am not challenging racism. I'm not actually challenging the structures that undergird my classes. Well, first thing, I have to be honest with you, let me think about this courageous conversation compass here. That's a very hard thing for me to say, because if that is true, then that means I am complicit in that, and that makes me feel some type of way. I'm feeling upset. I'm feeling that can't be true. I'm feeling denial. I'm feeling like this is a little bit too much for me to deal with at this moment. But again, this is where I can kind of move over to these things. If I can move away from my feeling and go over to my believing, if that was true, what would I believe? Well, if that is true, then I would believe that I have a moral responsibility and an obligation to go back and think critically about my grading structures, right? If it's true that I'm practicing passive racism in the way that I let traditional grading practices occur, I actually feel morally obligated. I have a sense of purpose that I need to go reframe those. And this is where, when I think about the believing part, okay, now I believe that I need to do something about it. Next thing is, well, how do I do that? Well, I don't have enough information, to be honest with you. I was never trained as an anti-racist scholar, nor was I trained in the psychology of learning or grading. So I actually have to go collect information about how I could think about this so that I can make some decisions. Well, as I did this, one of the things that was really helpful is kind of some of the healing that is involved in thinking through racism in my own life. And when I think about that response that I have, that very visceral response to the suggestion that I'm practicing passive racism when I'm using traditional grading, some words from DiAngelo come to mind. So what makes racism so difficult for whites to see? Well, the racist equals bad, not racist equals good binary. If as a white person I conceptualize racism as a binary and I see myself as not racist, what further action is required of me? Well, no action is required because I'm not racist. Therefore, racism is not my problem, it doesn't concern me, and there's nothing further that I need to do. This guarantees that as a member of a dominant group, I will not build my skills in thinking critically about racism or use my position to challenge racial inequality. Further, if I conceptualize racism as an either-or proposition, any suggestion that I have racist thoughts or feelings places me on the wrong side of that binary. As a result, all of my energy will go to denying and negating this possibility rather than trying to understand what these thoughts and feelings are and how they manifest in my action. And so one of the first things for me to recognize was that one of the ways that racism propagates in my life is if I fall into this racist equals bad, not racist equals good binary, because I want to be a good person. I have good intentions. And so any suggestion that I might be practicing some sort of racism, I'm going to deny fervently. But if I can get past that, if I can realize that racism is kind of like smog in the air, this comes from Beverly Daniel Tatum, and then if I live in this society, I can't help to breathe some in, but I also need to take responsibility for cleaning up the air. That's a different paradigm. It allows me to get past some of those defense mechanisms. So, when I'm thinking about this quote now armed with some new information about whiteness in my life, and also about the idea that perhaps I have ingested some racism in my life, and one of the things that I can do is get educated about that, right? All of a sudden, I'm feeling a little bit better about continuing to act, continuing to learn about my reality and think about what that means for my classes, and then acting on my belief. And the crazy thing is, the more I do this, the more in tune with my feelings, the more healing I do. It's really an amazing reality. So what you're about to see is that process of deepening this inquiry. And I love this quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. I promised myself I wouldn't get tattoos unless somebody in my family died an untimely death. But if I had a tattoo, I might put this one on my arm or something. It's one of these things that sticks with me. So in her book, Beverly Daniel Tatum writes, I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving along with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racists ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go the same direction as the white supremacists. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction, at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. So that visual sticks with me. The idea that if I just do what's normal, I'm actually acting in passive racism. The idea is, can I turn around and walk the other way? And that helps me reframe this question, right? My first question is, why do I have racial achievement gaps? I reframe that as, what if it were true that I was practicing passive racism when I let traditional grading practices go unchallenged? But now I have some tools to think about through deep reading and continual observation and reflection. Let me reframe this question in a different way. How do I become actively anti-racist in the way that I develop and practice my grading systems within my own classes, right? So now I'm not thinking about, why is this happening? What power do I have? I'm thinking, what can I do to be actively anti-racist, to counter the flow of that conveyor belt and walk the other way? And that's not an easy question. But luckily, one of the things, we are all trained professional learners, right? The degrees that we have basically confer us a formal certificate that says, I can learn. So as a math teacher who's tasked to inspire and empower young mathematics minds, one of the things that I need to do in this moment is get educated about how race intersects with math class. So if I'm thinking about developing anti-racist teaching practice, one of the first things that I can do is ask myself, well, what is an anti-racist? Ibram X. Kendi, a great historian, wrote a book on this recently. It was a fantastic book, and he defines an anti-racist as one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. He also says one who is expressing the idea that racial groups are equal and none needs developing and is supporting a policy that reduces racial inequality. Well, I definitely hold the thought in my mind that every student in my class, white, black, brown, Asian, Latinx, you name it, is a genius. When they walk through my doors, they are genius already. They don't need me to be genius. My goal is to empower them to see that genius within themselves and to cultivate it. So that is an anti-racist idea in some way. And it's useful to be able to reference that, right? That I actually hold this really powerful belief that my students are geniuses. And when I racialize that belief, when I think about how that's filtered through races, I can say my black students are geniuses. My brown students are geniuses. Every student that I meet is a genius. Now, the question that I have for myself is, how do I turn that belief into action when I'm thinking about grading? And this is where we get into policies, right? The whole concept in this talk is to think about grading policies. So what does Ibram X. Kendi have for us here? He says that a policy is a written or unwritten law, rule, procedure, process, regulation, or guideline that governs people. Well, good news, grading is just policies, right? Like all grading is policy. So that's kind of nice. It aligns with this because he then goes on to define an anti-racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. So now all of a sudden I can think, can I create written or unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern the way that students are graded in my classes that produce and sustain racial equity? So in reality, this talk should be titled Anti-Racist Grading Policies, but that is a little bit much for folks that have never seen it before. So grading for equity is a nice, I'm riding Joe Feldman's wave here, which I'll take. So all of a sudden, once I have those definitions in mind, I can now think to myself, well, this question about how do I become actively anti-racist in the way that I develop my grading practice, let me reframe that. In particular, how do I develop anti-racist grading policies that support student learning? So now all of a sudden I'm thinking about anti-racist grading policies to support student learning, right? Well, this is a lot. Right? There's a lot going on here. One of the first questions that I ask myself after I've centered race, and I'm thinking about anti-racist grading policies that support student learning is, well, what are grades? Right? If I'm gonna construct some policies that are anti-racist, I better be thinking about what those policies are designed to do. The place I'm going to start with this is dominant narratives. In the dominant narrative, from my understanding, grades are proxy measurements for learning. Right? Grades are designed to measure learning. High grades mean more learning. Low grades mean less learning. But let me filter that narrative through my now skeptical brain. And let me ask the question, how can I assess the truth value of this dominant narrative? Right? I am now thinking to myself that perhaps some of the grading policies that I am using are increasing racial inequality, which means that they're inaccurate representations of the geniuses that my students have. If I start with the proposition that my students are geniuses, and some students are getting higher grades than other students, and grades are a proxy measurement for learning, then my belief is not aligned with my actions, right? So I have to be able to evaluate whether or not this dominant narrative is true. Well, once again, let's go back to the research. What does the research on grading say? And this is where things get depressing or exciting. I'm not sure. I'll let you all decide what you think about this. So it ends up that there's like 40 years of research, academic research on grading. And it's not good news. Grades reduce students' interest in learning itself. Grades reduce students' preferences for challenging tasks. Grades reduce the quality of students' thinking. Grades spoil students' relationship with the teacher and with each other. And these are only 4 of 9. If you want more about this, this one right here by Alfin Cohen is a great, it's called From Degrading to Degrading. Just a beautiful blog post on this. But that's not all. It gets worse. There's this great book by Susan Blum. She writes, this is very, very well documented. She has like 40 references in this chapter on this. Grades are inconsistent, subjective, random, and arbitrary. Grades convey little information about what is being assessed. Grades discourage risk-taking, and grades emphasize teacher control and produce an intrinsic motivation. So there's a little bit of, this is either depressing or exciting, right? I can't, I have some ideas in time, but I'm reading this about grading, right? My job is I'm thinking to myself, I want to produce anti-racist grading policies. What is grades? Well, grades are measurements of learning. Let's see what the research says about it. And the research basically says they're complete fabrications. They don't work at all as intended. The dominant narrative is not only false, it's false 1,000 ways till Sunday. And here's a bunch of references that prove it over and over and over again. So now all of a sudden I'm a little upset, right? When I'm thinking about my compass, I'm kind of pissed off. I didn't create the grading system. I inherited it. And here I'm being told that I have to use a grading system that is, in research-based terms, completely useless. It does nothing that it intends to do. So now I think to myself, well, where did grades come from? Why are we using this completely inaccurate measurement of human learning? What's the historical reference? And it ends up, in Joe Feldman's book, he talks a lot about this, that grades are actually a historical, the historical legacy are connected with a few different movements. One of them is the Eugenics movement, the idea that there's a hierarchy between races. This is in terms of phrenology, measuring skull sizes and comparing black skulls to white skulls. The whole idea of the eugenics movement was very much aligned with a fixed mindset belief that intelligence is innate and immutable, and the job of authorities is to measure intelligence and dole out privilege based on that, right? This was in the turn of the 19th century. Many of the scholars, Patrick Morris, I'm hoping to support him in writing a book on this. He has a lot to say about the historical legacy, how eugenics shows up in so many of our assessment and testing processes. Grades also have to do with capital's control over government. So in the, when we were doing the Model T and all of these industrial processes, business owners realized that if they can control educational institutions, they could get cheap labor. They wouldn't have to train their labor. It would already be trained for them. So they actually lobbied government at the local, state, and national level to incorporate specialization. So kind of take classes and make it more and more specialized. Chain of command, so have an authority in the classroom. Timed routines, anybody see time tests there? And production line models, anybody see the way we fund education, right? More and more students with less and less teachers. So there's another part of the grading system. And the other one, the last one, is behaviorism and extrinsic motivation theory, which posited that the best way to teach humans is through extrinsic rewards or punishments, right? And you can read more about that in this book. There's a good introduction to the history there. Coming away from reading this literature, what I realized is that the letter grade system doesn't measure learning whatsoever, right? I see that in my own classes, but there's also a bunch of research on that. And the letter grade system was born in the intersection of belief systems that I don't hold. I don't believe in eugenics. I don't believe in fixed mindset view of intelligence. I don't think that the best way to motivate learning is extrinsic motivation. And I am sick and tired of seeing business owners and people with a lot of capital leveraging control over government to benefit themselves at the cost on our shoulders, right? And yet, when I am given a grading system, these legacies are in that system. So when I think about how do I develop anti-racist grading policies to support student learning, I cannot help but to conclude, given the research that I've done, I have to do everything in my power to minimize the use of grades in my class. It's the moment that I am forced to use grades, I am playing a game that is designed to break, right? And this is ironic, of course, because the state of California has a law that requires me, if I'd like to keep my job, I must assign letter grades at the end of my course. Yes, I did look at what law this was. You can look at Title V, Sections 55002 and 55023. I've written a blog post about one of these. I have much more to write on it. But this is ironic, right? I like to say that the requirement for me to use grades to measure learning is like telling a brain surgeon, please do very complex surgery with a butter knife and a rock, right? You could do it, but the results that you're going to get are not as good as what you could get with modern technology, right? So that's a constraint that I find in my classes. So we're thinking about what are grades, what are they designed to do? The dominant narrative is false. I got to use grades. Next question is to design my own narrative. And I can't help but to think about Patrick Morris in this moment, that grades are actually hypothesis tests. Anytime we're assessing grades, we're actually trying to ascertain what's happening in the brains of our students. So the only person that really knows what happened in the brains of our student is the student themselves, right? I have some real contentions. I don't like the words proficient and non-proficient. I think proficiency is, I don't like that framework, but I'm going to go with it because it's a useful way to conceptualize this. So when we're trying to assess a grade on a particular metric, the actual learning that our students have done, perhaps we can call them either proficient or non-proficient. We don't have access to any magic ball that allows us to measure this. This exists in the brains of our students. So what we do is we assess a judgment. We look at that, we do an assessment, and then we make a judgment on that actual learning. And that's a judgment call. It's a hypothesis set. We don't know the reality, but we're making a guess. Now, there's kind of 4 different options, right? If we judge our students to be proficient and they're actually proficient, we call that an accurate success. So the grade says that the student learned, and they indeed learned. Same thing, if we judge our student to be not proficient, in other words, they don't succeed in our class, and they actually didn't learn anything, we call that an accurate non-success. So grades say that they didn't learn, and indeed they didn't learn anything. Now, Patrick, I love one of the things he says, that equity work is in here, right? Closing the equity gap happens with the type of errors that we make. So there's kind of 2 errors. There's a type 1 error, which is a false positive, which is we judge somebody to be proficient, but they're actually not. So we say that they've learned, but they actually haven't, right? The other one is that a false negative. So the grade says that they didn't learn, but they actually did. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is multiple choice questions actually fall right in here. You can get a multiple choice question wrong for so many reasons. In fact, if I took a multiple choice test now in like an algebra class, I might on purpose get every single problem wrong. And that teacher might say that I am not proficient. But it actually takes some skill, as Nicole Gray and Patrick would say, to get every problem wrong on a multiple choice test, right? That's not an easy thing to do. And yet the grade is saying that I'm not proficient, even though I've learned a ton about that information. So one of the things that when I'm thinking about grading that I want to do is I want to minimize the errors that I'm making. And in particular, I want to find a better way to judge learning so that I'm not assigning false negatives. There is a belief in protecting against false positive, not giving grades that students don't deserve. But as we'll see, if I'm really caring about learning in my classes, we'll see this in a bit, how this shows up. So the whole idea here is to think about grading as a measurement of learning, right? So I'm trying to get a sense of where my students are. And this is where things get fun. And I know what you're going to say, Jeff, they've been fun the whole time. I love it. I love the feeling there. Well, when we think about learning, one of the claims that I want to make is that learning traditionally is actually much too simple. So in his book, Creating Significant Learning, L.D. Fink comes up with a paradigm for significant learning. What you're seeing here is my own take on that. I think his paradigm is a little bit too simple. I like to think about learning as happening in a lot of different spheres for our students. We have content learning, so foundational knowledge, content, facts, information, ideas. We've got skill development and applied thinking, project management, skill development, creative thinking, and then knowledge integration, making connections amongst ideas, multiple representations, disciplines. This is what traditionally most folks grade on. But I'm going to make a claim. If grading is all about learning, then this is not what learning is. This is a very, very small fraction of learning. In fact, I think it's the least important part if students are going to continue learning after my class. And this is where we get into what we call the character part of learning, right? Cultivate and grow hope for the future, belief in oneself, resilience, trust in others, physical health and body awareness, tend to athleticism, cardiovascular fitness, muscular strength, protect mindfulness. So that's about all their character. We also have learning that happens in community and society, participate in democracy, learn about sustainability, the environment, life on earth. And then we also have learning how to learn, caring and motivation, interest, curiosity, intrinsic motivation, drive, grit, values, vision, learn how to learn, create system navigation strategies, deep learning skills, self-regulation. I claim that so much of content in my heart is designed to empower these other spheres of learning, right? That content really comes alive when students start to filter it through other parts of their life. And yet, when I am grading, I'm missing so much of this, right? And so the question is, well, how can I measure proficiency in this space without shutting my students down in these spaces? Well, one of the first things I do is I center a definition of learning. So learning, I define learning as a growth process that happens inside the student's body, a learner's body, and leads to changes in their knowledge, beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes. These transformations occur based on their experiences and increase their performance, their potential for improved performance in future learning. So now all of a sudden, I'm going to base all of the work I'm doing in grading on the idea of measuring learning. And here's a definition for learning. You can read more in this blog post. It's quite a long one, and there's a lot of good stuff there. But the whole idea is I'm going to look for growth processes. So I have to look for change over time. And I want these changes to happen in knowledge, beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes. So that's what I'm looking for in my students, right? Now, next thing is when I think about learning, I like to break it up into 5 stages. Unconscious inexperience, you don't know what you don't know. Then you discover some new knowledge and you move to conscious inexperience. This is normally what lecture is designed to do. Lecture is not about learning in the long run. It's about exposing students to new ideas. So conscious inexperience, you know what you don't know now. So after lecture, you go home, then you actually start learning, right? So that's the understanding piece. And you develop conscious expertise. You know what you know. So after you understand something and you know what you know, you work to remember it. So you become an unconscious expert. You forget what you know. And I like to actually extend this. This comes from Susan Ambrose's book, but I like one more, which is to sustain. And I call a master learner a teacher. Those who can do, those who teach do better. Now, in my classes, when I'm trying to measure learning, I have to be quite realistic. I have 12 weeks, right? 12 weeks to work with my students. I no longer fall under the idea that in 12 weeks, students are going to be up here. This is a lifetime thing. So when I am measuring learning, my entire goal is to get accurate measurements of how much a student understands about a concept. If they can get to understanding, I'm happy with that. So when I'm measuring proficiency, my measurement ends here. Now, of course, I teach students how to create a second brain, as one of my mentors, Henry Fan, would say. So as they're developing understanding, create artifacts that allow them to remember years into the future. But I'm not going to force them to memorize. I don't memorize. As a professional mathematician, I do not memorize stuff, right? So the moment that I think about that, I start to think about, well, how does learning happen? How do we go from unconscious inexperience to conscious expertise? And this is where the concept of deliberate practice comes in. So when I'm thinking about deliberate practice, deep learning requires productive struggle. So on the vertical axis here, you see difficulty level, and on the horizontal axis, you see time spent learning. And I like to coach my students. All of these blog posts I share with students as I'm working with them, if they need it, right? Some students need it, some students don't. That's a one-on-one conversation. So 3 different levels of engagement. Comfort zone means too easy and maybe a bit boring. Sweet spot, this is where deep learning happens and deliberate practice. And then survival zone, this is where it's too difficult and beyond current capacity. Now, the funny thing is, I don't know where a student is on any particular idea. Or a better way to say that is, the best judge of what an idea is for a student is that student themselves. So what I need to do is help students recognize where their levels are at and constantly push them up into that sweet spot and give them the support that they need for that. So once I do this, right, I'm thinking about pushing them to get into that sweet spot, and I'm thinking about measuring learning for understanding. The next question I might ask myself is, what does it mean to understand math? What does it mean to really develop understanding? And I can't help but think about a very useful idea from a guy named Gershon Havel. He's at UC San Diego, and he talks about a concept definition as a formal, logically coherent verbal description, including technical jargon that appears in textbooks or provided by an instructor. So this is formal mathematics that we provide to our students. Let's contrast that with a concept image. And a concept image is a neural network or mental scheme. It's the actual collection of neurons in our students' brains that encode every concept definition in a math class, right? So when I'm measuring learning, what I'm trying to do is measure the concept image, is get an idea of what's going on inside the brains of my students and how does their brain encode any particular math idea, right? So everything a learner has associated with a particular concept and what the learner is able to do with regards to that concept. In my syllabus, these are actually all from my syllabus. My syllabus is 18 pages and it focuses on all of this. I have blog posts to support all of it, and students get trained over the quarter to talk through this stuff. This is the visuals that I give to the students. Concept definitions, these are formal definitions that exist in the textbook or that I give to you. And our job is your job actually, the only person that can translate that into knowledge is each individual student. So what you're going to do is you're going to study in such a way to integrate those ideas into neurons in your brain that are connected via wiring, right? When I assign grades, I am assessing that neural network. I'm literally trying to see how strong it is. And this is where my definition comes in. When I'm talking about deep learning, I like to think about a bunch of different categories of learning. I call this VANVISA, and then this stuff is well beyond the context of an introductory class. Once we're here, we're talking about like math majors in upper division or even, PhD candidates. This is, years of work. So when I think about what I expect of my students, I like to say VANVISA. I want verbal descriptions. I want them to describe mathematics in intuitive language and also nerdy formal language so that they can describe it for themselves and in the nomenclature of mathematics. I want them to be able to draw visual representations and really visualize what's happening. I want them to be able to inquire and feel intrigued. I used to imagine having students submit a final exam which was just questions, and I claimed that I could actually accurately grade a student based on the questions that they ask on a particular idea. Symbolic representations, can they write mathematics? Do they have command of notations? And also algorithmic calculations. If a student can demonstrate multiple dimensions for any particular idea, I call that proficient, and that they've guaranteed me that they understand, right? So now all of a sudden, I've reframed what grading is to measuring these dimensions for any particular idea. Now we get into anti-racism. So let me talk a little bit about what my classes look like. My classes are 100% flipped learning, so I provide free access to my YouTube videos that are correlated with supporting notes. So for many of my classes, I LaTeX up notes, and it's a textbook manuscript that I provide for free. They're not on Canvas. They're actually on an open access website that students can have access to 24/7, 365, even after the course closes, because learning doesn't stop just because the quarter ended. Class time is 100% dedicated to active learning in small groups of 4 students. So I partition, our classes are between 32 and 36 students, cut those into groups of 4, that's between 8 and 9 students. We have 2 days a week, so on day 1 I meet with 4 groups, on day 2 I meet with 5. Our classes range from about 120 to 135 minutes, so that's about 20 minutes per group. Sometimes we run over. 100% of class time, I'm in individual conferences with students, and each week 2 students in each group act as speakers, the other 2 are observers. While they speak, they actually document what's going on for them, what learning challenges that they have, let me show me your artifacts, let's talk about what you need, and we do targeted one-on-one feedback as an entire group to highlight their strengths and also give them targeted feedback. I don't use a single grade until the end of the quarter, period. In fact, at this point in my practice, I refuse to give grades. So the conferences focuses on progress, learning needs, and targeted feedback. If a student needs to be reassured about their progress, we will talk through that together, and I'm happy to go there with them, so I'm not restricting the conversation about grades, but that's not something that I bring into the feedback. So let me show you an example of what this means in my calculus class, just to give you a sense of what this looks like, right? And there we go. So these are all available for you on the blog post. So if you want to see this, you're welcome to see it. So this student, here's my grade book in Canvas. Not a single part of the grade book is graded for points. It's all complete or not complete. And a student is always working towards completion, right? So if they don't complete it on the first pass, they can get it on the second pass. This is literally the final grade book for this class, right? And then this is the grade book that I post online. This is in a Google Doc. Every student has access to it so that they can see it. This is not, yeah, so this is the actual progress for the entire course. Check means that they have met my definition of proficiency, that they get all the different, VANVISA, verbal, abuelita language, formal, nerdy language, visual description, inquiry, symbolic, and algorithmic. So if they have a check, they have shown me in one way or another that they've done all of those for the particular ideas. So up here are all my standards. These quiz questions map to actual content in the class. And then either student, when they submit their first draft, they get a hashtag, which means I do not see evidence of proficiency. Sometimes they have proficiency, but there's some stuff they need to clean up. Eventually they get to complete, and they can do this on multiple drafts. And you'll see when the blue ones are students that submitted stuff that got a hashtag or a circle, and then they resubmit it. So every student has a chance to do multiple submissions. Let me show you what this looks like with no grades. So this was a student's first submission. Here he's giving a least squares problem, right? So he's talking about this, and I see evidence, some of your misconceptions, errors. Please go back and try again, right? This is a problem on inner products. This is not even close. Like in some classes, if you got the right answer, this would be okay. This is maybe one dimension on that 7-dimension chart. This is algorithmic, but even still, I'm not even sure if he knows what he's doing, right? Like, I could have written this for him, right? There's no evidence that he's done this. Same thing here. So he submits a second draft. I don't have that second draft for you because I've been working really hard to get the other parts of this talk ready, but I wanted to show you the first draft of his next quiz. Same student. All of a sudden, starts to get real precise with language. Even still, this is not at all up to my standard. You'll see this. I give him a lot of feedback in this work about what I'd like to see from him. I want more verbal descriptions, right? So this guy is actually deriving the directional derivative from first principles with visual descriptions, etc. And what's crazy about this is within seconds, I can actually take a look and see, has he captured all of these ideas? And if I don't see it, I ask him some questions. And this is where the conferences come in, right? Because he's submitting this to me. I'm, quote unquote, grading in my own time. And then I'm referring back to it during the conferences, which means that we're having a continual discussion. Every assignment they get to do twice on their own. They're self-pacing their assignments, which is really interesting. And so I get 2 passes at this, right? And so by the end of the quarter, it ends up that for students that can stay engaged and have the type of privileges that our system assumes, every student is showing very deep conceptual mastery of the mathematics. And this is bar none. Like you can't avoid it in this mechanism. I have another example of how I did this in.
Okay, Jeff.
Yep.
Time is now 5:56. Let me know when you want to take their questions.
Yeah, definitely. So there's some other examples here, and I have some results here. Let me shut up. I did my best to stay on track. I so appreciate you, Manny. You're a scholar and a baller.
Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd love to get, if you're willing to, I'd love folks to respond to some of the questions in the Google Doc. So here's a Google Doc. If you go on that, let me just pull that up for you. You can kind of just respond to those questions. Thank you so much for your attention, y'all.
Jeff, we did link that Google Doc to our conference website. It's already up. So once people leave here, if they can't see the chat anymore, they will still be able to access it on our conference webpage. Awesome.
I also plan to link that onto this, onto the page for this talk. Please do so. Like here, what I might do is I might just copy these. So here's Jeff's response. I'll do this with you.
Jeff, I have one quick question.
Yeah.
Has your college been supportive of you not sharing grades with students? That's a barrier we have at our college, is that they get a little upset when we don't share grades.
Yeah, So the state of California requires that I submit grades at the end of the year, but there's no, in that language, I'm very careful to read all of the requirements in the actual law so that I know what I'm tasked to do, and there's no language that says that I must assign grades beforehand. With students, I recognize that grades are real, and I am always happy to talk through that with them. So oftentimes I find that students are really worried, like, my GPA matters, how do I do this? And I straight up say to my students, you are genius. If you can stick through the end of this class, you're going to get an A. Like, you can't get through my class. You physically cannot make it through my class without developing deep understanding. It's not possible. Now, it may be the case that you don't have enough time to learn, in which case I will surface that usually by week 5, because that's the second, like, by week 5, students, if they're falling behind, like, I'll see it because I'm looking at their work every week. And so from that standpoint, like, my students haven't complained because we as a team kind of work through that. My division dean is pretty supportive, and I'm now currently building cohorts of faculties to get other people on board to rethink that. So I guess the answer is yes, but I often find that the biggest pushback I get highlights some of the things that I need to go back and change in my own practices to help students feel less stressed about it, right?
You have a question, does every student either get an A or an F?
This one's hard. No, the answer to that question is no. I really like the W thing. If students are not progressing by week 8, my feeling is like we have to have a frank conversation. There are some students that get B's and C's. I'm young in this. I've only been doing the regrading thing for about 3 years. Very soon, I'm going to transition into letting students assign their own grades. There are some great resources from Staxine, 10 Ways to Hack Assessments, and also the Ungrading book that have wonderful ideas about empowering students to assess their own learning. It's a very hard task. It's about, 100 to 1,000 times harder than assigning grades for them, but I think it's worth it. So
the Ungrading book is an interesting read.
I wish I could tattoo that on my that book. I'm going for a second round next year, actually. Do you like that one too?
Yeah, we just did it in our equity book club. And, on the one hand, they have us, here's the ungrading, and then on the other hand, they're like, oh, but you still have to grade.
I want to create cohorts of faculty members who can use our union and our power to push the state of California to change that wording in the law. I think that's going to take 20 to 30 years, but what would the state of California say? You got to do brain surgery with a butter knife and a rock. Like, if that was written in the law, brain surgeons have to use a butter knife and a rock. I don't think any brain surgeon, the Hippocratic Oath, they could not do that, right? And yet, that's what we are being tasked to do. And so I think there's a contradiction there. There's equitable grading really is get rid of grades and focus on learning.